last week. We talked about the fact that the Lord's name is not used in the text. It is God, and that is because he is talking about having a relationship with your Creator, and that is an important component of the writing. And so the key question as we approach this book is, what can a woman find purpose in? What can we find meaning in life? And that's one of the greatest questions that all of us ever ask. And so as we dive into this, we're going to take a look. These are really like life labs. So Solomon's taking you into the lab and saying, hey, I did some experiments on life, and these are the conclusions that I come up with after I did these experiments. How many of you ever been in science class and you get to lab and you go in the lab and you do an experiment and you get to find out things, you get to work it out, not just learn it from a textbook? This is what Solomon decided to do with his life. He went to the life lab so that he could discover the purpose of life. And so let's pick up at chapter 2, and we'll pick up at verse 1, and we'll read the first section and then walk through it. This is Solomon speaking. He says, I said in my heart, as we've talked about, he talks to himself like we all do. But like I encourage you, it's better that you do that on the inside, not on the outside. And I'm joking. Yeah, come now. I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this was also vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched my heart how to cheer my body with wine. My heart still guided me with wisdom, on how to lay hold of folly till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses, planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. Also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold, the treasure of kings and the provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of men. So I became great and surpassed all those who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil that I expended in doing it. And behold, all was vanity, a striving after the wind. There was nothing to be gained under the sun. And remember, under the sun means here on earth without reference to God. So Solomon is talking to himself about what he wants to do. And so he starts off in verse 1 talking about he wants to do a little testing, and that he decided to do a test with pleasure. Some of you have taken that test. You've done that life lab, and you pursued pleasure. So you may be able to relate to Solomon in his exercise to maximize his own enjoyment. And so as we said last week, Solomon is the type of guy who dives in head first. He likes to be the guy who tries everything. And so the quick conclusion that he says is, I said of laughter, it's mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? In other words, laughter has a madness to it. He's not against laughter. He's just saying it's a bit crazy. And pleasure really accomplishes nothing. So is the purpose of life in pursuing pleasure? So one of the ways that we talk about the pursuit of pleasure in language is we call it hedonism. Hedonism is the form of living life for the sake of pleasure that basically is two philosophical differences. You have pleasure and you have suffering. And so the hedonist pursues pleasure. And so it's that pleasure is the highest goal of man. And so Solomon is not saying that pleasure is wrong. And the scriptures do not teach that pleasure is wrong. If you go back to the garden, when man was created and Adam and Eve lived in the garden, they enjoyed pleasure without sin and without the fall. Matter of fact, when we get to heaven, we will also be in a state where we are enjoying life and pleasure. And so God's not against pleasure. Suffering came into the world when we fell into sin through Adam, and that's why we face suffering. So this is not written to say, hey, all pleasure is wrong. We're going to talk about that as we move through these different pleasures that Solomon tried. So as we walk through this, the first pleasure that he searched out was in verse 3. I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine. My heart still guided me with wisdom, and how to lay hold of folly till I might see what was good. And so what the first thing that is highlighted by Solomon in his pursuit of pleasure was what we'll say is physical stimulation. In particular, physical stimulation through the use of alcohol, using wine to feel good and to enjoy himself. And so if drugs were prevalent in his day, I imagine he probably would have tried a little pot, a few other things, just because that probably wasn't as prevalent in his day. Well, it wasn't as prevalent. And so he was trying these things. And so many of you may have sought that out, and you work during the week, and then you look for TGIF. Thank God it's Friday and the weekend's coming, and I try to spend some time stimulating myself. How many of you, and you don't have to raise your hand, but I know it's probably true of many of you, you've had to cheer your body with wine. That's what he says. I want to cheer myself up by drinking some wine. Now, when I speak on alcohol, let it be known that I do not drink. I have not drank, and I don't say that pridefully. I just have not been a person who has ever tried alcohol. My dad was a drinker before he got saved and did not allow it in our house, so I didn't want to be caught by him early on. And then I started following Jesus, and I thought that's probably not where I want to go. And then, as you know, if you know my wife, her testimony before she came to Christ, she was alcoholic, and so she struggled with that. And so there's really no purpose for me to drink. Also, I'm a pastor in South Georgia, and so probably something I will avoid. And so with that doesn't mean that I haven't had experience with people who do it. And when Solomon writes this, and he talks about cheering himself up, so it's more of, I think what he's saying is he was looking for the pleasure of having the buzz, that warm, cozy feeling that you get. You feel good. I don't think he's talking about that part that you feel terrible. I think he's talking about that part that you feel good. So he would pursue this. And so in our culture, because drugs are so prevalent, it may be one way of saying, to get high. To get high means I have an elevated feeling. So what a lot of people in our culture would do is they pursue pleasure as a way of escape through some stimulation. And so, the Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians, don't get drunk on wine, but be filled with the Spirit. In other words, one of the things that we call alcohol are spirits. And then what basically Paul says is, don't be filled with spirits trying to fill yourself up, but be filled with the Spirit of God as you pursue Him. And so this idea that Solomon is throwing out is that he discovered that there is no real purpose in pursuing physical stimulation through drugs and alcohol. And so he says, this is not a worthwhile thing for me to do. When he says, till I might see what was good, in other words, what is worthwhile for the children of men who live under heaven. And so he says this is an issue for some of us. And he says, ultimately, if you're pursuing escape and meaning through a physical stimulation, you won't find it. You won't find it there. And some of you could come and testify to that fact. The second thing that he brings up is he starts listing all the things that he did with his money. And so if you pay attention for the next four verses and pay attention to how many times he uses I and my and myself. In other words, it was all about him. So he just made life all about him, the pleasure of it all being about him. If he would have been on social media, he'd been posting pictures and selfies of himself to everybody to see all the things that he was accumulating. So the second thing I think he helps us to understand is pursuing meaning through the accumulation of possessions, which would be, in our vernacular, be materialism. Has anybody ever invested themselves into materialism? Now, most of us in the room would say, I don't struggle with materialism. And I tell you, you lie, because we're all Americans and we are eat up with it to the fact that we do not recognize it. So how many sermons do you hear on shopping? You don't hear a whole lot of them. But the thing is we are enamored with possessions and the pleasure of having all this stuff. He says, he has houses, he built vineyards, he built gardens, he built parks, he built forests. Think about that for a second. He built all this stuff for who? For himself, for his own enjoyment, his own pleasure, that he could walk out in his backyard and have some tea, or maybe this is where he had his wine to cheer his body, and he could walk through his gardens, and he could go through his vineyards. And so Solomon had the means to do this. That's what we talked about last week, is the fact that Solomon had the ability and the finances to do all the research projects anybody would ever want to do. And so he built all these things to test himself with the pleasure of having the accumulation of all these possessions. He even went so far to say is that he even bought slaves. He had people to serve him. Because sometimes we think about life as being about being served. And so if we just had some people who would serve us, life would be better. It's the opposite of what Jesus said. Jesus said, I didn't come to be served, but to serve, and to give my life as a ransom for many. And so Solomon was pursuing this accumulation of things, of places, of slaves. He basically says he had herds and flocks. So he bought the farm. You think about it, and he bought it, and he made it his own. And so he says he had silver and gold and the treasures of all kinds of kings. He had a relationship with the queen of Sheba, and so he had all this stuff he had accumulated. And so when we think about the things that we have, we want more, we want bigger, we want better, we want faster. If we just had this or that. And all of us have been shopping, and the whole idea of shopping is when you go in, they want to put things before you so that if you get this thing, your life will be better. Every commercial is designed that way. If you will get this, this will change your life. If you get this, this will bring meaning to your life. And so all of us have discovered we bought those things, and then we found out that about 6 months later, they came out with a new one. iPhones, man, if I just get this iPhone right here, I got an iPhone 11. It's off the chain. And then like 6 months later, it's iPhone 12. It can do that. This is a piece of junk. And so anybody remember when there was no smartphones? Some of us. And so, and we didn't know there were, we just knew there were dumb phones with landlines. And things have changed, and you just want more and better. And so a lot of the shopping, and this will be really convicting for all of us, a lot of the shopping and a lot of the materialism, we do the same thing with it that a person does who is an alcoholic. We try to numb the pain in our life by buying more and more stuff. And so if I get more, then I'll feel better about me. I'll feel like there's more purpose to my life. The fascinating part of this is he says that he got singers, both men and women. And so I want to throw out the idea that the other pleasure that he was seeking was entertainment. And boy, let's preach here. This is good. And so entertainment. Are we amusing ourselves to death as a culture? We live in a culture that we are all increasingly seeking some entertainment avenue because we get bored with our own lives. If it's not going to the theater, if it's not going to a concert, or if it's not a sporting event, if it's not this or that, we are basically constantly bombarded by it and pursuing after it. If we had to sit down outside in a chair for an hour, we might lose our minds because we're not used to that. If you think about this, how big a deal is entertainment in your life, and how much does it get you off track from what God has for you and His purpose for your life? And then you have to evaluate that for yourself. And what I'm hoping will happen as we walk through this, whether it's physical stimulation through some sort of stimulant, or whether it's through shopping or whether it's through entertainment. What I hope will happen is that some of us will look in the mirror and the Holy Spirit will begin to help us to work through how this is affecting our life. And so it may be I need a fast from shopping, or maybe I need a fast from entertainment. And so we all have TVs, and they sit in most of our houses right in the middle of the house, and we're constantly seeking entertainment. And I'll confess that I do this as well. It's a struggle. And when I get confronted with things like this, it really sets in my own life to think about how addicted I might be to entertainment. And now that we do have phones, entertainment stays in our pocket, in our hand, and so that we spend more of our time looking down rather than looking up. We spend more of our time on our phones and social media looking for entertainment than maybe we spend looking to see what God's wanting to say to us. Now, my hope is that if our smartphones are in our hand, that we are not just entertaining ourselves, but it can be a great tool to actually spend time with the Word of God and listen to preaching and worship music. So there's a good side to that. So don't hear I'm saying, hey, throw away your smartphone. You know, we're not going to have, like if you're old school like me in church, like in the 80s, we had record burnings and, your music was bad, so we had a burning. We're not going to burn smartphones here at Grace Point or anything like that. I'm just throwing out the idea that, look, maybe we need to evaluate our own life and our pursuit of meaning and purpose through entertainment. Obviously, Solomon had this. He went all out in this. And what's interesting about this is he says that in his heart, he'd been working, so he's toiling. He says, and this was my reward for my work. In other words, this is how some of us look at our lives. So I work hard all week. So when I get to the weekend, I'm going to reward myself. I'm going to enjoy myself. And that's what Solomon said. I work, and that's the TGIF part of it. Thank God it's Friday because I've worked hard, and so I'm going to pour myself into my own entertainment, my own shopping, and I finally achieved this. And so he says, I've got these goals. I've worked hard for them during the week, so now I'm going to relax, I'm rest and enjoy. And that was Solomon's attitude. And so as he writes about this, entertainment had to be one avenue for that. I mean, Las Vegas, it's built on entertainment. And the fact that we as Americans will go there and pursue entertainment. Now, all those other pleasure things are in Las Vegas. But I even throw out to you this, is that Disney is built on the same thing. And so we don't really think, well, Las Vegas and Disney are not the same. They're both entertainment venues that we are driven to. And I'm not saying don't go to Vegas, and I'm not saying don't go to Disney. I'm saying we all have to evaluate our entertainment choices and what role it plays in our life for meaning and purpose. And so with that in mind, here's the other thing he says. He says, and he had many concubines. And so he also was seeking meaning through sexual stimulation. He had 300 concubines and 700 wives. Let that sink in for a moment. That's a lot of women. I don't know if he had a lot of drama, but he had a lot of women. I'm not saying women are full of drama. I'm just saying that's a lot of women. So with that, he obviously was pursuing sexual stimulation, and what he discovers is that too is not going to provide him the purpose and meaning of life. It's not what God designed for his life, and so this is another area that he was pursuing him. Achievement. I mean, this is a pursuit for him, and so that Solomon was, the envy of every man, and maybe the goal of every woman is that, hey, if I could be with Solomon, because he literally was the man in his day. Matter of fact, there's probably nobody in history was more the man as we talk about it than Solomon, because he had more than everybody. He could do what he wanted to. Nobody compared to him. And so he accomplished those goals and lived for himself and rewarded himself. So verse 11 is where he gets into the conclusion of seeking purpose from pleasure. And so he says, then I considered all that my hands had done, the toil that I had expended in doing it, and behold, look, all was vanity, a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. He said, I went after it with my whole heart, pleasure to grab it, and it was like smoke. Remember, we talked about that last week. Vanity is smoke. So you can't grab it. Like, it's there, but you can't grab it. And so he says, this is what pleasure has been like. Pleasure is ultimately unprofitable. It's frustrating because it doesn't last. Why? Because pleasure has a short shelf life. It doesn't last long. And that's why we got to keep being stimulated. When I was in youth ministry, we used to teach our students the law of diminishing returns. In other words, when you have something that you enjoy, that it doesn't last long. The definition that I would put to it is the tendency for the continuing effort and enjoyment of a particular goal or experience that declines after a certain amount of time. In other words, so when the way we would teach it in youth ministry is this. So this guy, he starts dating this girl, and maybe, the first time, like, he gets to hold her hand, and that's great, man. He's so excited he gets to hold her hand, and then the next time he gets to, put his arm around her, and that gets a little old, so he wants to move to the next step. And if you follow the course, eventually that's where you end up is going past places that, teenagers don't need to go. And so, but it's a law of diminishing returns, is that I have this experience, but I want a greater experience because that experience is getting old, is getting stale, so I want a fresh experience. It's the problem with people who end up with addictions to alcohol or drugs, is that they want a higher high. They want a greater experience, and so what it does is it seeks to bring them in, and so as they pursue it, they begin looking for more and more. They want to reproduce that great feeling they had at the beginning, so they start, having more and more because it's the law of diminishing returns. They can't get back to the enjoyment they had, and so what happens is they keep going for it. And, I think of it like this, is that he says that pleasure is ultimately unprofitable. I think about it when you go to the state fair up in Perry and you get the cotton candy, and it tastes really good, but it don't last very long. It has a short shelf life, doesn't it? And it's like, in cotton candy, let's just be honest, it doesn't do any good for you or anybody else. It just takes money out of your pocket, and it leaves you still hungry. And so this is what I believe that Solomon is saying when it comes to pleasure, that it's not something that's going to last for you. And here's the thing I want to dive into real quickly about pleasure. Pleasure in and of itself is not a bad thing. That we were created to experience pleasure, that we're hardwired for enjoyment. The problem is we've sought to find out outside of God and His will for our life, which is where we find purpose and meaning. And I love this quote. We're going to put it on the screen. This is C.S. Lewis in his book, The Weight of Glory. It's probably my favorite quote when it comes to living life. And I remember the first time I read it, I was just blown away about it. But I want to read it to you because most of us in the room, we think the problem is that our desire for pleasure is way too strong, and that's really our problem. But C.S. Lewis, and I agree with him, is saying, no, the problem is our pleasures are too weak. We're easily satisfied. So here's what he says. Indeed, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, in other words, by Jesus, it would seem that our Lord Jesus finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink, sex, and ambition, which is what Solomon is talking about pursuing, when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. Man, what an incredible quote. And it's not just that it sounds good, but it's just true. We think that, like, our desire for pleasure is way up here. And really, what C.S. Lewis and I think what Jesus is saying to us, and more importantly, is that it's way too low. Like, we're too far easily satisfied with taking the mud pie and making things in the slum, and we don't really understand that there's an offer by Jesus to go to the sea and to build sandcastles. And we don't see it because we've never experienced, we're ignorant of it. And so I think that's ultimately a way to capture what Solomon is saying as he goes into the Life Lab and he indulges in pleasure and says, this is what I've discovered. And so his reflection on this starts in verse 12. So let's read the next few verses. So I turn to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. And then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this is also vanity. For of the wise as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after the wind. So Solomon says in verse 12 that he's tried it all, and that anyone coming after him that tries these same experiments, they set up their own lab and tries these things, they're going to discover the same thing that he has discovered. And what he's saying is, you don't have to go down that path. You don't have to go down the path of pleasure to discover what he's revealing to you, as the Holy Spirit has him write this book, that you can learn the easy way and not the hard way. But some of us in the room, let's get a testimony, we like to learn the hard way. But Solomon said there's an easy way to learn this, and so his conclusion is that that's the way that I would want you to go. And so what did Solomon learn? He learned several things, and one of the things that he says here is wisdom is better than folly. Wisdom is better than foolishness. It is certainly better to be a wise guy than it is to be a fool. I think all of us would agree it. That's he's telling us that wisdom brings a better quality of life. Just like light is better than darkness. If you walk around in light, that's better than walking around in darkness. The other night, our dog went missing, and we were trying to find Chloe, who was missing. And so it was dark outside. It had been a lot easier to look for her if it was light, I promise you. Going through the woods at night with a flashlight is not as easy as going through the woods during the day. And so it's better to be walking around in the light than in darkness. So truth is better than lies. You know that. That's what you teach your kids. Son, daughter, it's better that you tell the truth than to tell a lie. And so you agree with Solomon that it's better to do this. Reality is better than illusion. So you see this, and so you apply this, that life is better when we make good and wise decisions. 4 things that I want to put before you that I think amplify this. That even if you were not a follower of Christ, if you did these 4 things, the quality of your life would be better. The first one is this: avoid debt as much as possible. So handle your money wisely. If you have conversations like I do with people and counsel with people, they'll tell you they wish they wouldn't have gone in debt. Why? Because when you go in debt, you make yourself a slave to a master. Whether it's a Visa or MasterCard or whoever it is, you owe them, and so you're in debt to them, and it's better to be free than it is to be a slave. And so we are called as Christians to be under Christ and let him be our master. And so I've known people in the past who had decided to go to the mission field because they felt like God was bringing them there, but they could not go until they got rid of their debt. And so it's better to avoid that as much as possible. Second, absolve others, so you should forgive. you should practice forgiveness, that you should fight anger in your life. The practice of forgiving is important not only to the person that you're releasing from the debt they owe you, but also the importance of forgiveness in your own soul. Because when you lack the ability to forgive, you become bitter, and it seeps out into every relationship that you have. Some of us have struggled with anger because we've been bitter towards someone, and then we have found later that has gotten into other relationships because we can't get past what somebody else has done to us or what somebody else has said to us. So the encouragement I would give you is to forgive. Now, the basis for us forgiving is always Jesus Christ. I'm not really sure why anybody would forgive anybody ultimately if they have not been forgiven. But if you have been forgiven, then you should be readily available to forgive those who have hurt you. And so I would encourage someone to forgive. The other thing is to keep it pure. Don't have sex outside of marriage. Sex outside of marriage is dangerous. It's like fire. Fire is a great element. We use it for all kinds of things. And so at your house, when fire is in the fireplace, like you probably want that tonight in Douglas, Georgia, when the few nights that you might get the fireplace rolling because it's cold outside, it warms your house. It makes it cozy. It's a great thing. But if you take that same fire and you put it on your couch and it catches your house on fire, it'll burn it down. And sex outside of marriage, that's how it works. It burns down relationships. So it's not designed to just be, and it's God's gift to us, and it's His idea, and so He knows how best to use it. And so He says that you should pursue it, not just for the sake of His glory, but you should pursue this because it's for the sake of your own good. It's for the sake of your own good. Fourth thing is that I would say be a person who tells the truth. One of the things that we have really impressed upon our boys is we wanted them to, as they go through their life, to learn to be respectful of people. We wanted them to not be people who were deceptive. And so we always talk to them about telling the truth. Even when they've done something wrong, look, if you've done something wrong, don't lie to me about it, to be honest about it. We hear stories constantly in the news of people who say have lied on a resume and then they finally got found out and they lost an opportunity. Maybe you've experienced lying. Like I know in my life, I've told some lies and they seem to always come back and haunt me. Even like in middle school, I lied to my dad, and it was one of the worst mistakes I ever made. When my dad found out, I thought he was going to kill me, but he didn't. Praise God. And so I could be your pastor. And so these are the four things I think that as just people on the earth, if you live by that kind of wisdom, I mean, the quality of your life will be better. And so what he says is, wisdom can make your life better, but there's one thing that's true is that living by wisdom makes life better, but what doesn't change is even the wise and the fool all have the same fate. They all die. So he says, ultimately, like, the fool's going to die and I'm going to die. And so here's what he says. So in verse 14 and 15, he says, the wise and the foolish share a common fate. Both will die. The wise man may have a better quality of life, but ultimately that may lead to a better quality of life and a longer quantity of life. But ultimately, we all have the same fate. We are going to the grave. And so Solomon says it is better to have wisdom, but don't miss that at the end of it, the wise and the fool will share in death. We'll all die. So being wise doesn't make you miss death. So with that in mind, he says not only that, he says the wise and the foolish will be forgotten. How many of you know who Charles Spurgeon is? You at least heard that name. Most of you? Charles Spurgeon. Church people know that name. Well, I got a shirt with, that says Spurgeon on it. He was a pastor in the 1800s in England. Like, I don't know who the first mega church pastor was, but he was a mega church pastor. and he had this large church. He died in 1892. I would venture to guess, and I've not been to England, but I would venture to guess if you went to England and asked a lot of the people on the street who was Charles Spurgeon, many of them would not know, even though he had this huge church a few centuries ago, because he is forgotten. And that's really Solomon's point. If you were to ask people who Solomon was, a lot of people probably wouldn't even know, because we are easily forgotten. The wise and the foolish share the same fate. They're going to die. They're going to be forgotten. So here's some thoughts that Solomon writes to us as we get to the close of chapter 2, starting at verse 18. He says, I hated all of my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he'll be wise or a fool. Yet he'll be the master of all for which I have toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about, and I gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. Somebody didn't work for it. And what has a man from all the toil and all the striving of the heart which he toils beneath the sun? For all of his days are full of sorrow. His work is vexation. Even in the night, his heart does not rest. This is also vanity. There is nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom, knowledge, and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to the one who pleases God. This is also vanity and striving after the wind. So here's some conclusions that he makes on wisdom. So find purpose in the Creator, not just in creation. And so he says, number 1, verses 18 and 19, I can't take it with me. All the stuff that you accumulate, you know where it's going to stay? Right here. It's not going with you. You're not going to put it in your casket and be able to take it with you into the afterlife. So you come into the world naked, you're going to leave naked. So you have empty hands when you come in, you'll have empty hands when you leave. And so you can't take it with you. And so ultimately, that's frustrating. And Matthew's Gospel, Luke chapter 12, Jesus addresses this very thing of this continued accumulation of stuff. In verse 13, chapter 12, let me just read to you. These two brothers are getting in an argument about the inheritance. And so here's what happens, because they want to get Jesus on their side. You ever try to get Jesus on your side in an argument? So this is what they were doing. So someone in the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. But he said to the man, who made me judge or arbiter over you? And he said to them, Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist of the abundance of his possessions. So it's not. So in other words, this is Jesus saying what Solomon said 1,000 years before. Life ain't about possessions. You're not going to find meaning and purpose in possessions. And he told them a parable, saying, this is just a really great parable on this subject. The land of the rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Enjoy it. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul is required of you, but the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich toward God. In other words, you're going to die. And the problem is, it's not your stuff and you can't take it with you. And so, what are you going to do? And so, he says, it's not your stuff. All of us, Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. All of us are stewards. You know what stewardship is? It's temporary ownership of somebody else's stuff. That's all we are. We're stewards. And that's not a bad thing. Hopefully we're God's stewards of God's stuff. And we realize that, and so we understand. My cell phone, that's God's. My car, that's God's. My house, that's God's. The money in my pocket, the money in the bank is God's. I'm not taking it with me. So the question ought to be for all of us, so what should I do with God's stuff? It's not the question, what should I do with my stuff? It's what should I do with his stuff? And so then that changes how my relationship is to my possessions. Because I understand I can't take it with me. And so Solomon says this, and Jesus is bringing it home for us. And so in verse 20, Solomon's frustrated because my work is for nothing. Anybody ever feel like that? What am I working for? Why am I doing all this hard work? Now, if your labor, we talked about this last week, 1 Corinthians 15:58. If your labor is for the Lord, it is not in vain. But if your labor is done without reference to God, it's in vain. And so, labor that is for your personal glory, without any reference to God or connection with him, is going to lead you into frustration. The psalmist writes in Psalm 127, verse 1. Let me just read it to you. You won't have this on the screen. I didn't give it to them to put up. It says this, and this is actually Solomon, by the way. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. And so, let me finish reading this because it's really good. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating bread of anxious toil, for he gives sleep to those he loves. And think about what he's saying. We build, but God is ultimately the one who builds. Your success really ultimately is on God. You work hard, but ultimately he is the one who gives you success. And if you build without reference to him, it doesn't matter if you're earthly successful, you're not really successful because it does not give meaning and purpose to your life, and it does not save your soul. Jesus said, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and build a kingdom and have it all to himself and lose his soul? Because it does not bring purpose and meaning to our lives. Then here's the other thing that's depressing. Verse 21 and 22. Somebody else will get my stuff when I die. And here's the problem. You don't know what they're going to do with it. You don't know if they're going to be wise and they're going to multiply it and make you good. And like most of us, we're like, we want to make our kids' future. But like, you don't know what your kid's going to do. You might work hard all your life and then your kid blow all your stuff like in a month. You don't know. And so, Solomon's saying, I worked hard and I built this and I built that. And then after he died, the kingdom got totally split up. And he says, you don't know who's coming after you and what they're going to do with your stuff. And he said, that's frustrating. What's going to happen with all my stuff? And that's where you go back to the theological point. It ain't your stuff. It's going to be somebody else's stuff. Right now, God's giving you temporary stewardship over, but eventually somebody else is going to have your Jeep, my Jeep, going to have your stuff. They're going to have your stuff, and they're going to throw a lot of it away. They're going to be like, this is old school. We got some new stuff coming out. You're going to find your stuff at the Salvation Army. I found one of my CDs from my sermon at the Salvation Army. Nobody bought it. It's 99 cents. So anyway, I digress. Verse 23, more accumulation brings more anxiety. Can we get a witness? The more stuff you get, the more stress you get because there's more to lose. When I had less, I ain't worried about it as much because I ain't have that much to lose. Now I got more, I worry about it. When I had an old car and it was all beat up, I didn't worry about it, like having a scratch or a dent. Got a new car? Oh, that's how you look at it. Causes you more stress, and that's the point. Did you catch what Psalm 127 says? Those who build a house without the Lord, they labor in vain. But he also says, he talks about Those who watch, the watchtower, who are kind of looking out over their stuff, when you get more stuff, you're looking out. Look, you really can't protect your stuff, really, ultimately. If somebody wants your stuff bad enough, they'll come take it from you. If they got a bigger gun and they're sneaky about it, they will come take it because it's not really your stuff. And so God protects it. And so more stuff equals more stress. Let me read to you Jesus on this kind of idea. Matthew chapter 6, and this will be on the screen, verse 19 and 21. He says, do not lay up for yourselves treasure on earth. Why? Where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal. So that wasn't my idea. That was Jesus said, look, here's the problem with your stuff. You accumulate all the stuff, and the problem is you got a moth getting in your closet, eating on your clothes. Your car's out rusting even when you put it in the garage. And then you got somebody who wants your stuff, and they're going to put a mask on and come take it from you. Anybody ever had your stuff stolen? Window busted out in your vehicle? Most everybody in the room. Everybody gone in the closet and looked at their clothes like, where did this hole come from? And then you got to go buy something else. And that's what Jesus is saying. So he says this. So it's because that happened, he says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So where is your treasure? And you should lay it up in heaven, because there it doesn't go away. It's not destroyed because it matters. So that's what Paul means in 1 Corinthians 15 when he says, your labor for the Lord. Invest into eternal things, not temporary things. So lay your treasure up in heaven, safe and sound. Ultimate conclusion that he's making is find your purpose in the Creator, not in creation. Like, do you feel it when we're reading it? Like, it's almost depressing. It's like, I hear you, Solomon. It's been a long day at work. What am I doing all this stuff for? And if you can shift your work, no matter what you do, to see God's big purpose. Like, you don't have to work at Grace Point Church or some other ministry, so to speak, to find purpose and connect it to the gospel. Everybody in here can find that if you live in reference to God. I'll never forget hearing this story years ago about Taking Care of Business was a series Andy Stanley did. And one of the things that was interesting about it, he said that there was this guy, and his job was to clean porta potties. Let that sink in for a second. His job was to clean porta potties. I don't know if you've been in a porta potty lately, but because we do track and cross country, there are always porta potties around. And when you go in them, you just feel dirty. At least I do. Have you ever thought somebody cleans that joker? And so he's telling this story about this guy who was cleaning porta potties, and he was singing and found joy in what he was doing. And then he was asked why he did that, and his comment was, because he works for the Lord. He doesn't work for the company. And it says it's important what I do. And I'm like, man, that's what I'm talking about. That's knowing your labor is not in vain because of what you do is for the Lord. Now, the interesting thing about this as he gets to the conclusion, and he says, there is nothing better for a person. That word better is actually not in the Hebrew. It's added. It's maybe implied, but if you read it without better, it says there's nothing for a person than that he should eat, drink, and find enjoyment in his toil. In other words, there's nothing man can learn or experience or make himself have a real purpose or lasting joy in and of himself. And so where does that come from? Solomon's point is that comes from being in a relationship with God, that knowing that he's a creator and that he has given you purpose. In other words, let's say it like this. You cannot find your purpose in yourself. Your purpose lays outside of you in God. That's where the purpose lies. You will not find it in yourself. You will find it in him who created you. That's what he's saying. He's saying you can do all this stuff, but you, at the end of the day, are not going to find what you look for. He says, to the one who pleases God, God gives him certain things. He gives him wisdom. He gives him knowledge and joy. What are those things? He gives him the ability to make good decisions in his life, which is doing the right things. He gives him knowledge, which is understanding his ways, so he knows the right things. And he gives him joy, which is the experience of the goodness of God, a lasting pleasure, and he feels the right things. So what God does for you, he gives you wisdom, knowledge, and joy, which helps you to know the right things, do the right things, and feel the right things. That's what God does for a man's life. And you cannot find that in yourself. In contrast to that, he says, hey, the sinner, as he winds this up, he says the sinner goes about his work under the sun without reference to God. He accumulates all this stuff, and then he dies. But the one who follows God, he works, and he knows that the stuff you accumulate on earth stays on earth, but that you have eternal treasure. And so here's the thing. If you accumulate all this stuff on earth without reference to God, and it stays here, one day there's going to be accounting for everything. And God is going to take everything that is, and you know what he's going to do for us? Everybody who's in his kingdom is going to be a steward again in his kingdom. And so everything left on earth is going to be under his dominion. And so you will be back in place stewarding God's stuff. The great thing about heaven is when you steward here back on earth what God has designated for you based on your faithfulness in your time right now, what you'll get is to be able to steward, but you still are stewarding his stuff. It's not yours. But the people who are, and by sinners, he's not saying all of us are sinners, but some of us are saved by grace, but by God, by placing our faith in God through Jesus Christ. Those people, when that accounting takes place and everything is reformed, you go to Revelation and you see that accounting and that reestablishment of the throne of Jesus here on earth. He's going to allow us to be stewards again. And guess where that stuff that's been still here is going to be? It's going to be distributed among those who love him. And this is what Solomon concludes. And so he says, hey, if you want a truly profitable life, then live for the glory of God and work for him. If you want to have an unprofitable life, work for yourself. And you'll find it comes to nothing. If you work for God and his glory, in the end, you really get everything because you get God, which is all you need. But with God, there comes the benefits. But the benefactor is the one that you're pursuing, and out of that, one of the perks is you get the benefits. If you don't want that, then live your own way. But as Solomon says, there's a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. It leads to separation from everything that you actually want. Knowledge, wisdom, and joy. And this is the message of Solomon after he went to the lab and said, hey, I'm going to pursue pleasure and see what comes of it. And he says, really, I found that pleasures that we have are really weak. That our pleasure needs to be elevated to see that God is the prize. And our relationship to him is the prize. And how does Jesus say it? Seek first the kingdom of God. And what? All these things will be added to you. Everything that you truly want will be given to you because you find it in God, not in yourself. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this message that you give to us to remind us of the things that get distracting in our life. And all of us need to come to a place in our own life where we evaluate it and we say, maybe I'm spending too much time, too much energy, too much attention on things that really don't profit my life. And maybe some of us need to come to the place tonight where we go, the way I've approached my work on a daily basis is without reference to you. The way I've gone about it, the way I've done it, the way that I think about it, the way that I speak about it. Maybe tonight would be a time where you connect, hey, like the guy at the porta potty, that the things that I do because I work for the Lord, and know that when I work for you, no matter what I do, it's never in vain. So, Father, wherever we are in life, I pray that we would begin to pursue the greater joy of knowing you, the greater joy of serving you, the joy of being loved by you, that you created us, and that is our purpose. We did not create ourselves, and we cannot find that meaning and that significance and that satisfaction in and of ourselves. So thank you for your word, which lifts us up, which points us to Jesus, who is our hope in all things.